The video for this evening is a vocabulary review in preparation for your first vocabulary assessment tomorrow in class. The format of that assessment is going to be 3 different types of questions. You're going to have some questions that are essentially like a short answer, where I'll ask you to use the concept or the term in a way that demonstrates your understanding of it. There will be some matching, and then there will also be a set of questions that ask you to, you have a description of a word, and you have to choose from a list of multiple choices which is the correct term being described. So I asked you today in class to give me a list of 6 words that you wanted for sure to review. And so I'm just going to, I have in front of me the vocabulary notebook, and I think it would be good for you to have that out. And I'm going to go through some of these. I think Northwest Ordinance, I think we went over pretty clearly. You should have in your notes that process by setting up new states. Constitutional Convention, I think we were good on. New Jersey Plan and Virginia Plan, very few people asked for. Great Compromise and 3/5 Compromise, those are those Constitutional Convention compromises. The Great Compromise established a bicameral legislature where we have a House and a Senate and how representation was decided. And then the 3/5 Compromise dealt specifically with slavery and how slaves were going to be counted towards the population counts. Ratification, I feel like we're pretty good on. I feel very strong that you guys are good on anti-federalist and federalist. So let's start with this next one here then, federalism. Okay, federalism, and I have some related terms here that some of you put on your lists. The executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch. Federalism, and I'm going to just make this a little bit larger real quick so we can see it. Federalism is this concept. Federalism is the idea of taking the power of government and sharing it between 2 kinds of government. So the central government, like we have in Washington, D.C., and state governments like we have in Springfield, and having them exist at the same time and doing things in either powers that are specifically given to the central government or powers that are specifically given to the states, or as you can see on this Venn diagram, some that they have in common. This obviously is also going to be a big source of the problem that we talked about in class today, which was the issue of strict construction versus loose construction. You know, if the central government has the powers that are listed in the Constitution, what about those implied powers? What about the elastic clause? And if the 10th Amendment really does give everything else to the states, how can the central government do things? The reason I say these are related terms is that when they created this central government, they split it up into 3 branches. The thinking there, and what the Federalists pointed out in the Federalist Papers, those essays that they wrote to support ratification of the Constitution, they created these 3 branches so that they could take even the power of the central government, which was something that people feared, right, distant authority, and they could, in a sense, create something that was not as strong because the 3 branches had some balance between them. So if we come back to this, that takes Federalist Papers, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. Remember, the Anti-Federalists demanded a Bill of Rights before they would ever consider ratifying the Constitution. Those that were able to be convinced to do so. Page 4, we are not going to worry about any of those 4 terms. The Electoral College, you should have in your notes. We went over this, that process of electing the president. And then those 3 branches I just talked about right here under federalism. So precedent. I talked about this in the last video. A precedent is, something that's done. It's an example to be followed. So, for example, President Washington, when he becomes the president of the United States, almost everything that he does becomes a precedent for future presidents because he's the first one doing them. The best example that I can give you, and I'll try to work in another term here, if you look at page, oops, sorry, I'm flipping. If you look right next to it, right next to it on page 6, right next to precedent is the word cabinet. This is a precedent of George Washington's. George Washington knew his own limitations, and so he wanted to have advisors surrounding him that could help him lead in areas that he maybe didn't feel as strongly suited, like the Treasury. So he creates a cabinet, a group of advisors that are, officially linked to the government. They are like the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, and by him doing so, he established a precedent, and presidents thereafter do that. Tariff I feel pretty good on. Let's flip to loose construction. All right, and loose construction was this one right here. I'm sorry, loose construction was this one right here. And loose construction could also embody this idea of the elastic clause, which you can flip over onto page 8 and find. And the idea of loose construction is when I look at the Constitution, I have to make a decision as to how it is. And by the way, pause if you need to and write these things down, or pause and review. I'm going through them kind of quickly just so this video isn't too long for you. Loose construction is looking at the Constitution and deciding how it should be applied. And what we talked about in class, we made the comparison to like fundamentalism, where the literal word is what you translate it into and how you apply things. Loose construction would be the opposite of that, where you look at the text and you say, right, this is written this way, however, it's open for interpretation. It needs to be adaptable was one of the words that we used. And the specific part of the Constitution that helps the loose constructionists, Hamilton, apply their thinking is that the number 18 in section 8 of Article 1, which is the necessary and proper clause, or as we have it in your vocabulary, and as a term that you should be comfortable using, the elastic clause. And that leads naturally into strict construction. And strict construction is the Jefferson thinking, where now we're looking at the Constitution a little more literally. We are looking at the 10th Amendment, which says that if there are powers that are not delegated to the, I'll go back to this real quick, if there are powers that are not in this part of the circle, they are naturally this part of the circle. They don't overlap, it's over here. Cut that out. And that's what Jefferson wanted to be the prevailing thought on the Constitution, is that this isn't adaptable. It is a binding agreement, and that'll come important when we talk about nullification in a second. Right? It is a binding agreement between the state and the central government. There can't be things that change. It can't be open for interpretation because that isn't necessarily what the states agreed to. So let's take a look at the National Bank. Some of you wanted to do this or want me to review this. The National Bank was set up by Hamilton in order to facilitate the country's finances. And so here's what he envisioned. He envisioned this is the National Bank, right? The money that the National Bank would have would come from taxes, so this is money coming in, or private investors. And he loved this idea because he thought if wealthy Americans invested in the Bank of the United States, then they would have a stake in seeing this country survive. And he liked that idea. He thought that would bring the elite to support this government. So this is money coming in. This is money going out, right? Debt payments, they need money to pay off their debts. They just took on more debts, as you remember from the assumption. Loan payments, loans, not loan payments, loans going out to people, as a bank would, it would loan money. And you could get some income off the interest of that. But then the United States also had all this land to the west that they could sell, which would also produce an income. And so what Hamilton wanted to do was to create this debt, this ongoing debt, so that the United States could create good credit, as we've talked about in class. And then the bank would facilitate those funds and build the health of the economy and help to foster the growth of the American economy. If we look at the next term, and we're flipping the page. I know that I'm skipping Whiskey Rebellion, but that was on only 2 people's list. And the Alien and Sedition Acts, I will quickly go over one more time. Again, I don't want to get into the details of the quasi-war with France, the small war with France, but what you should be aware of is during that war, the Federalists took advantage of that situation to pass laws to try to silence their critics, the Democratic Republicans, which if you go back a page, right, the Democratic Republicans, that's Jefferson's party. That's the Jeffersonian Party. And what they did is during that war, they passed a law that limited specifically First Amendment rights. And it was technically illegal to write editorials that were critical of the government during the time of war. People were fined. Some people were even jailed. And what that leads to, more importantly, is to this. And I'm going to see if I can't really quick here just play this. Let's see. Right, so if you can see this, we talked about this a little bit in class today. the idea that, I'm going to move this over just so you can see, the idea that the Constitution is a contract. Oh, I'm sorry, fourth period, we didn't do this. So let me go into detail on this. This may take a couple more minutes, but if you really want to understand nullification, you can watch the rest of this. If you feel like you've got it, you don't have to watch the rest of this, but fourth period, you need this. So pay attention here a little more closely. Nullification is Jefferson's reaction to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what he says is that, let's see if I can't resize this a little bit. What he says is that the Constitution, and that's this C in the center, the Constitution is like a contract. And the individual states, all these S's are individual states. And what is represented here is that the states, upon ratification of the Constitution, really got into a binding contract with this new central government. And what we would see, what Jefferson would say there is, this is an agreement between the two. They both hold power, as federalism would point out too, right? And so what Jefferson would say is, when you do something like the Sedition Act, where the question that we're left with is, the central government clearly passed a law that violates the contract, because part of that contract is freedom of speech, freedom of the press. So if they knowingly or willingly pass a law that violates part of the Constitution, it's unconstitutional. Jefferson said, what happens? What's the recourse for that? And since there was nothing in the Constitution that spelled that out, Jefferson suggested this, that the Constitution is therefore being ripped up by the central government. They are passing a law that is violating that agreement. So what Jefferson says, and what this arrow represents, is, let's say this individual state, and let's just say that that state is Kentucky, because when Jefferson writes this, he actually writes it in something called the Kentucky Resolution. He says, this state right here, this individual state that got into that agreement, right, that got into the agreement and signed that contract with the central government, that individual state has the right to say, this law, right, they got into this agreement, this law that you passed, and let's just say it's the Sedition Act, right, this law that you passed it legally, you had the right to pass it, maybe even you deemed it necessary and proper, but because in this state, in Kentucky, we believe that it violates the contract we agreed to, we are going to nullify that law. And so this is the theory of nullification. I don't know why that keeps happening. I'm going to have to edit this out. Right? This is the theory of nullification. The idea that an individual state would get to decide, right, would get to decide if a law violates the Constitution, and if it does, they would get to void that law in their state. So what he was saying in the Kentucky Resolution is that Kentucky has the right to say, we are not going to enforce the Sedition Act in this state because it violates the contract, the Constitution. I would say if you have questions about any of these terms, feel free to email me. I think I went through most of these anyway in this video, but specifically got into the 6 that you wanted me to cover a little more specifically. So hopefully this was helpful. Like I said, you're going to have some kind of short answer where you have to demonstrate your knowledge of the terms or concepts. You're going to have some matching, and then you'll have some, what are really multiple choice, but you'll have kind of a description or the word being used in a context, or being described in a context, and then you have to choose which word that would be. All right, so 3 parts. I feel like you guys are going to be fine on it. All right, good luck. Happy studying.